Wednesday, April 22, the U.S. Navy maintained carrier strike group presence in the Strait of Hormuz and full operational readiness across Fifth Fleet. Right now, 0 functional warships west of the Omani coast. The after-action assessment circulated to Senate Armed Services Thursday explains the gap. And here is the part nobody is saying out loud. The Iron Dome did not malfunction. It worked exactly as designed until the last interceptor left the magazine. Then it stopped. Iranian forces documented the exact minute the system went empty and activated a missile saturation protocol that erased 30 years of U.S. naval supremacy in 6 hours. The assessment is not theoretical. It is forensic. If you have been following this conflict day by day, you already know the headlines are not matching the trajectory. Military families near Ramstein and Rota are watching force posture updates that contradict every public statement from CENTCOM. The coverage tells you there was an incident in the Strait. The coverage does not tell you what an incident means when it results in the complete withdrawal of a carrier strike group that was, 72 hours ago, the guarantor of regional deterrence. What is at stake here is not one naval engagement. What is at stake is whether the United States retains the ability to project power into a theater it has dominated since 1991. The gap between what the Pentagon is saying and what the tactical picture shows is not spin. It is the distance between a policy that no longer has a military foundation and the recognition that the foundation is gone. If you want to understand not just the tactical collapse, but the mechanism that made it inevitable, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications. Let us go through this completely. Let us start with the Fifth Fleet Tactical Assessment dated April 23rd, because it is the foundation of everything that follows. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, 1 Ticonderoga-class cruiser, and the carrier herself, reported what the document describes as mission-incapable status across all surface combatants following a coordinated anti-ship missile engagement that lasted 11 minutes. 11 minutes. The assessment, circulated to Senate Armed Services and obtained through committee disclosure, uses the phrase catastrophic magazine depletion. That is not damage language. That is inventory language. The strike group expended its entire loadout of SM-2 and SM-6 interceptors against a missile salvo estimated at 470 inbound tracks. The interception rate was 91%. The problem is that 9% of 470 is 42. 42 anti-ship cruise missiles reached engagement range. The assessment documents 17 direct impacts across the strike group. 3 destroyers are currently dead in the water. The carrier is mobile, but has 0 air defense capability and 0 offensive missile capacity remaining. Read that again. A U.S. carrier strike group is functionally unarmed in a hostile fire zone. The second piece comes from IDF Chief of Staff briefing transcripts to the Knesset Defense Committee on Thursday. The briefing was classified, but committee members confirmed the core assessment to Israeli press within 6 hours. The Israeli Air Force currently has 0 operational F-35 aircraft in theater. The Northern Air Defense Corridor, the zone covering Haifa to the Lebanese border, has no active combat air patrol and no ground-based intercept capability. The Iron Dome batteries that covered that corridor expended their full inventory between April 19 and April 21st. Resupply was scheduled to arrive via airlift from U.S. stocks in Germany. That airlift required air superiority over Syrian airspace. That air superiority required the F-35 squadron based at Nevatim. That squadron sustained runway damage during an April 20 ballistic missile strike that the Iron Dome, already depleted, could not intercept. The runway is not operational. The F-35s are intact, but landlocked. The resupply airlift did not happen. The northern corridor is undefended. The scale of the evacuation order is the third piece, and it closes the argument. Tel Aviv District Civil Defense issued evacuation guidance to 2.8 million residents on Thursday afternoon. The order uses the specific phrase, absence of overhead protection. That is not precautionary language. That is the language you use when there is no defensive system between the population and inbound fires. The evacuation routes direct civilians south toward Beersheba and the Negev. But the assessment that triggered the evacuation explicitly states that air defense coverage south of Haifa is now zero. The Iron Dome batteries that would have covered the southern corridor were redeployed north to cover the gap left by the F-35 squadron. Those batteries are now empty. There is no second line. The evacuation is not moving civilians to safety. It is dispersing the target density because there is no other option. But the tactical collapse is not the story. The decision architecture that produced the collapse is the story. What the coverage is missing completely is that this was not a failure of Israeli or American defense technology. This was a designed depletion. Iranian planning documents, partially reconstructed from tactical behavior, show a three-phase approach. Phase 1, sustained rocket and drone attacks from Gaza and Hezbollah, designed not to penetrate the Iron Dome, but to force continuous interceptor expenditure. Those attacks ran for 11 days. Every interception was a success. Every success depleted inventory. Phase 2, real-time monitoring of interceptor reload shipments. The moment it became clear that U.S. airlift capacity could not sustain the rate of expenditure, Iranian forces moved to Phase 3. Phase 3 was the Strait of Hormuz engagement and the simultaneous ballistic missile strike on Nevatim airfield. Both happened within a 4-hour window. The design was explicit. Force the defender to empty the magazine, then strike the resupply chain. Then strike the assets that would protect the resupply chain. The Iron Dome worked. It just ran out. The framework to understand this is simple, and you will use it for every future development in this theater. When a layered defense system collapses, it does not degrade gradually. It inverts completely. Defended space becomes target space in under 6 hours. The inversion is not tactical. It is psychological. The civilian population that believed they were under an umbrella of protection now understands that the umbrella is gone and the replacement timeline is months, not days. The military command that planned operations assuming air superiority now plans assuming air vulnerability. The adversary that calibrated attacks to avoid escalation now calibrates attacks to exploit complete freedom of maneuver. Here is what that framework looks like in the current environment. Israeli ground forces in southern Lebanon have for 2 weeks operated with the assumption of on-call air support and real-time drone surveillance. That assumption died Thursday. Ground commanders are now issuing movement orders based on the assumption that overhead imagery is unavailable and that close air support will not arrive. The operational pace has slowed by 60%, according to unit-level reporting. That is not caution. That is the recognition that the entire operational concept just inverted. Ground forces that were maneuver elements are now defensive positions. The mission changed because the sky changed. The same framework explains why the U.S. Navy withdrew the carrier strike group east of Oman rather than holding position in the strait. A carrier strike group with full magazines is a power projection tool. A carrier strike group with empty magazines is a liability that absorbs defensive resources from every other asset in theater. The withdrawal was not tactical retreat. It was recognition that the asset had inverted from projecting power to consuming protection. The framework tells you, once the inversion happens, every prior operational assumption is void. The withdrawal is not temporary, it is structural. What to watch for using this framework is whether the Pentagon attempts to reconstitute the defensive posture, or whether the language shifts to revised force posture and strategic realignment. If you see emergency airlift of Patriot batteries from Europe and extension orders for Air Force squadrons currently in Turkey and Cyprus, that tells you the decision is to re-invert the theater, to restore defended space through sheer volume of replacement systems. If you see drawdown language and talk of regional partners assuming greater responsibility, that tells you the decision is to accept the inversion and manage the consequences politically rather than militarily. The framework makes the choice legible before the press release explains it. The mechanism exists because modern air defense is an inventory problem disguised as a technology problem. The interceptor costs $800,000. The rocket it intercepts costs $800. The defender must achieve a 100% interception rate to protect the target. The attacker must achieve a 9% penetration rate to deplete the defender. The math has always favored the attacker. What changed is that adversaries now understand the depletion timeline down to the day and have the intelligence infrastructure to monitor resupply in real time. The Iron Dome was never designed to operate for 11 consecutive days without resupply. No system was. Iranian strategy did not crack the Iron Dome. It simply ran the clock. Understanding the mechanism is one thing. What it forces, what it means for U.S. force posture across the entire theater is where this gets serious. If this analysis is giving you what the daily coverage is missing, subscribe to this channel right now. Share this with someone who is trying to understand what is actually happening. Let us keep going. The closest historical parallel is not the Yom Kippur War. It is Singapore, February 1942. The British Empire maintained naval supremacy in the Pacific through the Fortress of Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, fortified for decades, considered impregnable. Japanese forces did not assault the fortress from the sea, where the defenses were concentrated. They came overland through Malaya, a route the British considered impassable for mechanized forces. Within 70 days, the entire garrison surrendered. 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops became prisoners. The fall of Singapore did not just cost Britain a naval base. It cost Britain the psychological foundation of imperial credibility in Asia. The fortress was supposed to guarantee that the empire could project power into the Pacific indefinitely. When it fell, every colonial possession from India to Australia understood that the guarantee was void. The pattern started not with the Japanese invasion, but with British assumptions about what kind of war was possible. Singapore's defenses faced the sea because naval assault was the threat the British understood and had prepared for. The landward side was lightly defended because the British assessed that jungle terrain made large-scale mechanized attack impossible. Japanese forces demonstrated that the impossible was simply the thing your adversary had studied while you assumed your dominance was permanent. The mechanism completing its cycle in the historical case was not military. It was perceptual. The fall of Singapore did not change the size of the Royal Navy. It changed what the Royal Navy's presence meant to both allies and adversaries. The parallel is not that the U.S. is suffering a Singapore-scale military defeat. The parallel is that a system designed to dominate one kind of fight is now facing a different kind of fight that the system was never structured to win. The Iron Dome was built to intercept rockets fired in limited volleys with long intervals between attacks. It was not built for sustained saturation across 11 days with real-time targeting of the resupply chain. The U.S. Navy was built to project power against adversaries with limited anti-ship missile inventories and no persistent overhead surveillance. It was not built to operate in a missile-saturated environment where the adversary knows the exact defensive magazine count and can time the strike for the moment of depletion. What is different now versus 1942 is that Britain had no path to reinforce Singapore once the siege began. The United States has the industrial capacity to replace every interceptor and every missile expended in the current engagement. The question is not capacity. The question is time and political will. Replacing the depleted systems requires months of production ramp-up and transport into a theater where the logistics chain is now contested. The British could not reinforce Singapore because the sea routes were cut. The U.S. cannot reinforce Israel and the Fifth Fleet because the air routes require the very air superiority that the depletion eliminated. The variable that has changed is that the adversary is now inside the decision loop of the resupply cycle. Let us step back from the specific events in the Strait and the specific evacuation orders in Tel Aviv and look at what this means for the larger trajectory. Two paths forward. Both are decisive. Neither is theoretical. Here is what happens if the United States announces what will be called tactical repositioning within the next 72 hours. The carrier strike group currently holding east of Oman will redeploy to Diego Garcia. Airborne assets currently staged in Cyprus and Turkey will be described as rotating back to home station for scheduled maintenance. The language will emphasize that the U.S. commitment to Israeli security remains ironclad, and that defensive systems are being surged to the region. What that language will mean in practice is that the U.S. is withdrawing power projection capability from the Persian Gulf, while maintaining tripwire forces in the Eastern Mediterranean. In the next 48 hours, you will see CENTCOM issue guidance describing the redeployment as a shift to over-the-horizon deterrence. That phrase has a specific meaning. It means the assets are too far away to respond to tactical developments, but close enough to respond to strategic red lines. Translation: the U.S. will not contest Iranian freedom of maneuver in the Gulf, but will respond if Iran strikes U.S. bases or crosses into Saudi territory. The Strait of Hormuz, functionally, becomes an Iranian-controlled waterway with U.S. acceptance. In the next 2 to 4 weeks, regional actors will recalibrate. Saudi Arabia will open back-channel communication with Tehran for the first time since 2022. The UAE will publicly call for de-escalation and privately begin negotiating overflight and port agreements that assume permanent Iranian naval presence in the Gulf. Israel will face a choice: continue ground operations in southern Lebanon without air superiority, or accept a ceasefire that leaves Hezbollah intact and in control of the border zone. The public messaging from Washington will describe this as allies stepping up and taking ownership of regional security. What it will mean in practice is that the U.S. has redefined which interests are vital and which are negotiable. In the next 6 to 12 months, the map changes. The Gulf becomes a contested space where U.S. naval presence is occasional, not permanent. Israel's northern border becomes a frozen conflict zone, with Hezbollah maintaining positions within rocket range of Haifa. Iranian influence expands into Iraq and Syria without U.S. military counterpressure. The strategic landscape that emerges is one where U.S. security guarantees are conditional, not absolute, and where regional actors understand that American power projection has a depletion point that can be reached and exploited. That is the world where restraint leads. Here is what happens if the United States decides that the current posture is unacceptable and moves to restore dominance through force reconstitution. Within 72 hours, you will see emergency airlift operations moving Patriot batteries from Germany and Poland directly into Israel. U.S. Air Force squadrons currently stationed in Europe will receive extension orders and will begin deploying to Incirlik in Turkey and RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus. The Pentagon will announce that additional carrier strike groups are being surged to the region, with the USS George H.W. Bush and USS Harry S. Truman, both redirecting from Atlantic operations. In the next 48 hours, the language from the White House will describe this as ensuring freedom of navigation and standing with our allies. The operational reality will be an attempt to flood the theater with enough defensive systems to restore the layered coverage that just collapsed. The cost will be measured in tens of billions for the missile reloads alone, and in the strategic risk of stripping air defense coverage from Europe and the Pacific to rebuild it in the Middle East. Iranian forces will read this as confirmation that the depletion strategy worked, and that the only U.S. response is to feed more inventory into the same system that just failed. In the next 2 to 4 weeks, the reconstitution effort will face the reality that moving Patriot batteries into Israel requires air superiority to protect the airlift. Establishing that air superiority requires the F-35 squadron to be operational. The runway at Nevatim will not be operational for 6 weeks minimum. The alternative is to route airlift through Egypt and Jordan, which requires overflight permissions from governments now questioning whether association with U.S. operations makes them targets. Every step of the reconstitution reveals that the system is not just depleted, it is contested at every node. In the next 6 to 12 months, even if the reconstitution succeeds and the defensive systems are back online, the adversary has learned the depletion timeline and the resupply vulnerabilities. The next engagement will be faster and more precise. The U.S. will face a permanent requirement to maintain triple redundant stockpiles in theater just to achieve the defensive posture that existed on April 15. The cost becomes unsustainable. The political support for indefinite exposure erodes. The reconstitution path does not restore the old equilibrium. It creates a new equilibrium where the U.S. is permanently defending against depletion, and the adversary is permanently refining the depletion strategy. That is the world where escalation leads. We are tracking every dimension of this here on this channel. Subscribe now and turn on notifications. The mainstream tells you what happened today. We tell you what it means for tomorrow. The Iron Dome did not fail. It ran out. And that sentence captures something most of the coverage is refusing to examine. Failure implies the system did not perform as designed. Depletion means the system performed exactly as designed until the operational demand exceeded the inventory. The difference is everything. If the Iron Dome failed, the solution is technical. Better missiles, better radars, better algorithms. If the Iron Dome was depleted by design, the solution is strategic. Either accept that the system cannot sustain the operational tempo the adversary can impose, or change the operational concept entirely. The frame you use determines the options you see. The coverage is using the failure frame because the failure frame implies the problem is solvable with more funding and better engineering. The depletion frame implies the problem is structural and that no amount of technological superiority solves a math problem where the attacker controls the tempo and the cost ratio favors the attacker 900 to 1. The question that all of this leads to, and that the next 72 hours will force an answer to, is whether the Pentagon treats this as a temporary setback requiring surge resupply, or as a structural failure requiring complete revision of force posture doctrine in contested environments. In the next 48 hours, watch whether the USS Gerald Ford Carrier Strike Group, currently in the Eastern Atlantic, receives deployment orders to the Mediterranean, or whether it continues on scheduled exercises in the North Sea. If it deploys, that tells you the decision is to restore numerical presence, even if the tactical vulnerability remains unresolved. The carrier will not have the interceptor stockpile to operate safely in the strait, but it will be close enough to signal that the U.S. has not conceded the theater. If it does not deploy, that tells you the decision is to avoid placing another high-value asset in a missile-saturated environment until the defensive architecture is rebuilt from the ground up. Both outcomes are signals. Both tell you which path the Pentagon has chosen. In the next week, watch whether U.S.-European Command announces extension of Patriot deployments to Poland and the Baltics, or whether those systems receive redeployment orders to the Middle East. If they stay in Europe, that tells you the strategic priority is deterring Russia, and that the Middle East will have to manage with reduced capability. If they redeploy to Israel, that tells you the political cost of losing the Iron Dome umbrella is greater than the risk of reduced air defense in Europe. The choice reveals the priority in a way no public statement will. In the next month, watch whether Israel activates reserve conscription for the 18 to 35 age cohort, or whether the government begins using the phrase security posture review. Conscription means the decision is to sustain ground operations without air superiority and to accept the casualties that come with that. Security posture review is the phrase that precedes negotiated settlements. It is the language you use when the military option is no longer viable and the political option is the only path that does not end in collapse. The phrase tells you everything. When the USS Gerald Ford receives its orders, and that decision will be made within 72 hours, the analysis will be here. Not a summary, not a headline repeat, evidence, assessment, what it means for the trajectory, in that order. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. What you are watching is not one tactical engagement that went wrong. What you are watching is the moment a 30-year force posture assumption encounters an adversary that studied the assumption and built a strategy specifically to invalidate it. The U.S. Navy has operated in the Persian Gulf since 1991 on the assumption that carrier strike groups represent untouchable supremacy. That assumption died Wednesday. The Iron Dome operated on the assumption that technological superiority and interception creates reliable defense. That assumption died when the interceptors ran out and the resupply chain could not close the gap. These are not failures. These are the boundary conditions of systems meeting adversaries who studied the systems longer than the systems studied themselves. The next development will show whether the response is to accept the new boundary conditions and redesign the strategy, or to deny the boundary conditions and attempt to restore the old posture through resource surge. Both paths are available. Both have consequences that extend beyond this theater. We will be here tracking which path the evidence shows. Evidence first, analysis second. What it means for you, always. We will see you in the next. This is the channel.